Last time, Abraham died and Isaac inherited the blessings and the promises as head of the family line. With his wife Rebekah, he had two sons, Esau and Jacob, who were vastly different in character. Although Esau was the firstborn, Jacob, God's chosen successor to Isaac, was able to get his brother to relinquish his rights as guardian of God's promises and then to be blessed as principal heir by his father. While traveling to Haran to escape Esau's murderous anger, in a dream Jacob was shown a stairway from earth to heaven that symbolizes what the deliverer will do. Later, he has 12 sons and was renamed Israel by God. God's story now focuses, beginning in Genesis 37, verses 1 to 4, on Joseph, the favorite son of his father Jacob, having been born to him later in life. Though obviously not distinguished by the special blessing and firstborn rights of his generation in the family line, Joseph nonetheless has a very real relationship with God. Later in the narrative, he would be identified alongside other historical figures known for their faith. The account of Joseph's life starts when he's 17 years old and working as a shepherd under his brothers as they tend the family flocks and fields. Joseph informs his father Jacob about some bad things the brothers are up to. Their resentment and criticism turns to hatred after their father gives Joseph a particularly fine robe as a measure of his favoritism. Their hatred is fueled further when Joseph tells them a dream he's had in which they are represented by bundles of grain that bow down to him. This is described in Genesis 37, verses 5 to 11. As we'll see later, this dream was actually God pointing to events that will unfold later in the narrative and reminds us again that God exists outside of the confines of time. And he has full knowledge of things that to us are still future. Later, in another predictive dream, his family, this time symbolized by planets, bowed down to him, to Joseph. The resentment, the jealousy, and hatred of Joseph's brothers continues to grow, and it can't be contained any longer. You can read in Genesis chapter 37, verses 12 to 36, how one day Jacob sends Joseph to check on his brothers who've taken the flocks to pastures a long way from the family home. The brothers seize the opportunity. Their first thought is to kill him, but when they see a group of Ishmaelite traders on their way down to Egypt, they sell Joseph to them as a slave. The brothers send the distinctive coat back to Jacob, their father, covered in goat's blood, and he believes that wild animals have killed Joseph. Meanwhile, Joseph is sold as a slave to Potiphar, an officer of the king, the Pharaoh of Egypt. Joseph's situation in Egypt proves not to be terrible, at least for a time. God says in his narrative, this is in Genesis 39, verse 2, that he was with Joseph and helping him to succeed in the house of his master, the captain of the Pharaoh's guard. He becomes Potiphar's personal attendant and is put in charge of the entire household. Eventually, he's made administrator of all his master's affairs. But trouble is brewing. You can read about this in Genesis 39, verses 6 to 20. How Potiphar's wife propositions the young, handsome Hebrew. But he refuses her, and because he's unwilling to betray the trust invested in him by her husband, but more importantly, to sin against God in this way. In resentment after repeated refusals, she maliciously accuses Joseph of trying to rape her. He's thrown into a prison, which the text says is where the king's prisoners are held. But here too, we're told, this is in Genesis 39, verses 21 to 23, that the Lord was with Joseph and showed him his faithful love. He, that's God, is orchestrating events. Joseph becomes a favorite of the warden and is put in charge of all the prisoners and the running of the place. The next part of the narrative, Genesis 40, records an incident in which God gives Joseph the ability to interpret dreams for some former high-ranking fellow prisoners. It seems an isolated incident, but it's something that will prove important 2 years later when Pharaoh has two very disturbing, apparently predictive dreams described in Genesis chapter 41, verses 1 to 13. It's worth noting here that God was perfectly able and willing to communicate in this way to the ruler of a culture which had long ago turned away from him, from God, as their true storyteller. As Pharaoh, as the king, he was given semi-divine status in that culture in quite a complex system of polytheistic beliefs with a multitude of deities. The sun and the Nile River were among them. Creation myths and elaborate rituals, religious rituals were part of that structure, that system, the religious culture there. When divination experts, what's called magicians and wise men, are unable to make sense of the dreams of the king, it's remembered that a young Hebrew slave in the king's prison has abilities in this area. When sent for, Joseph denies the ability to divine such things himself, but he asserts that God is able to clarify the meaning for Pharaoh if he chooses to. This whole incident is recorded in Genesis chapter 41, verses 14 to 32. The Pharaoh recounts his dream of 7 emaciated cows eating 7 well-nourished cows, and another in which 7 diseased heads of grain swallow 7 healthy heads of grain. Joseph explains to Pharaoh that God has revealed to him that this represents 7 years of prosperity that he, God, will bring to Egypt, followed by 7 years of famine. Joseph suggests, this is in chapter 41, verses 33 to 36, that someone be put in charge of Egypt to coordinate the collection and storage of crops during the plentiful years against the following time of want, of famine. This idea's merits are obvious, and Joseph, having impressed Pharaoh with his intelligence and his wisdom, is promoted to the position. In fact, as you can read in Genesis chapter 41, verses 37 to 46, he's given a rank in the nation of Egypt that's answerable only to Pharaoh himself, a very elevated role. Now in Genesis chapter 41, this is verses 47 to 57, it describes events unfolding just as God had said they would. Joseph, in his position of enormous influence, sees to it that the surplus is gathered and stored during the 7 bumper years. Then the famine hits. Egypt and also the surrounding countries of the area are gripped by drought and food becomes short. Now Joseph's foresight pays off. The storehouses are opened and distribution begins, and people from neighboring countries are forced to buy grain from Egypt. To the northeast, Canaan is severely impacted by famine as well. Hearing that grain is available in Egypt, Jacob, Joseph's father, sends his 10 sons, Joseph's older brothers, to buy some food to tide them over. You can read about this in Genesis chapter 42. They come before the governor who oversees the sale of the grain. But they, of course, are unaware that it's Joseph. But he recognizes them as they bow before him, in fulfillment of that predictive dream he'd had from God so many years ago. He accuses them of being spies, but they protest their innocence, stating that they are 12 brothers with one missing and one back home in Canaan, the youngest. Joseph sends them back to get their younger brother, the youngest of the 12, as proof of their story, keeping one, Simeon, as hostage. With the famine worsening, the brothers returned to Egypt to buy more food, this time with their youngest brother Benjamin. Joseph stage manages a number of events which put the brothers under a great deal of stress, but eventually he reveals his identity as the brother they'd sold into slavery years before. Of course, they're dumbfounded. Pharaoh and the palace are delighted that Joseph has renewed contact with his family. Pharaoh insists that Joseph sends for his father to come to Egypt in wagons provided by Pharaoh. Jacob, also known of course as Israel, and the entire extended family, along with all their possessions and their livestock, come to Egypt. And they settle there and as a people group come to be known as the children of Israel. And his 12 sons, of course, would be the patriarchs of 12 tribes. For the human players in all of this, it would have played out as just the sequential experiences of life. They had no way to see all the immediate connections or future implications of what was going on, but God was hands-on involved in working the events seamlessly together for his purposes. Remember the prophecy he had made to Abraham, Jacob's grandfather, that his descendants would go to a foreign land where they would be strangers. The plan was on track. He was and is writing his story of reality in and through the lives of people.